The United States is by far the most powerful country on earth. Powerful enough to destroy any country's economy if they want, cut off any country from the global trade within a fortnight, and freeze any country's money that took them years to accumulate. And an essential foundation of American power and influence worldwide can be attributed to the US dollar, which plays a central role in the global financial system. So in this video, let's deeply understand how the US dollar became the most powerful currency in the world. August 1971, the French government sent its warship to the US. The aim was to load their gold reserves stored in the US and bring them back to France. This immediate action by France was a direct response to the infamous declaration of the US president at that time, Richard Nixon, which came to be known as the Nixon shock. Wait, what is this Nixon shock, and why does even a superpower like France store its gold in the US? So this story goes back to 1913, when US used to be just another country. In fact, it was in a recession. And then in 1914, the First World War happened, and the US experienced one of the greatest economic booms. This was the time when the majority of the developed countries pegged their currencies to gold as a way to stabilize currency exchange rates. What this means is that they had equal amount of gold reserves for the total amount of circulated currency. But suddenly there is a dire need for money to fund this war. And what did these countries do? Well, many countries started suspending their gold standard to pay their military expense with paper money, which of course devalued their currency. A key point to observe here is that although the US economy surpassed British economy way back in 1890, global trade was still centered around Britain, with transactions taking place in British pounds. So Britain held to the gold standard until 1931 to maintain its position as the world's leading currency. But the catch over here is that while all other major empires were busy fighting, the United States used all of its manpower and capital to become a major supplier of wheat, copper, automobiles, weapons, ammunition, and thousands of other raw and finished goods to the Allied powers, and in exchange, they paid the US in gold. As a result, the US, which was in a recession until 1913, experienced one of the greatest economic booms in the next 41 months. The total value of the US exports grew from just $2.4 billion in 1913 to $6.2 billion in 1917. And you know what? The same thing happened during the World War II, wherein the US became a war merchant and entered the war only after Pearl Harbor. Two of the most expensive wars in the history have ended, but left some unrepairable damages to the participating nations. By the end of the World War II in 1945, Britain's national debt had soared to approximately 27 billion pounds in nominal terms, which was about 270% of its GDP at the time. This debt burden was massive. The United Kingdom had gone from being the world's greatest creditor to the world's greatest debtor. And by conducting business out of these two wars, the United States had accumulated 70% of the world's gold reserves. 70%. And if you look at this graph, you will see that their gold reserves went up from just about 2,000 tons in 1910 to more than 21,000 tons in 1949. As the United States now owns the majority of the gold, a return to the old gold standard became impossible. This is where, ladies and gentlemen, the US took the opportunity to gather 44 countries all across the world to sign something called the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. So what was this Bretton Woods Agreement, and how did it strengthen the position of the US dollar as a leader in the world? The Bretton Woods Agreement was established to make financial relations between the United States and its new allies easier. As per the agreement, all the countries in the system make their currencies exchangeable for a set amount of US dollars, and the US dollar itself would be exchangeable for a set amount of gold, such that 1 ounce of gold or 28.35 gram of gold would be worth $35. In this new system, the US dollar was backed by gold, which indirectly made currencies of all the participating nations gold backed in their own right without requiring them to keep massive gold reserves themselves. On top of that, the Bretton Woods Agreement gave rise to the formation of two major organizations, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. So with the funding of the United States, the World Bank issued huge sums of money to the countries whose economies were devastated by the war, so that they could rebuild their economies. At the same time, the IMF kept its eye on the global economy and assisted policymakers. And if you see, the Bretton Woods Agreement made it extremely convenient for countries to engage in trade, but of course it has its own set of flaws. First, let's talk about the benefits using a simple example. Let's assume a scenario where Japan wants to purchase crude oil from Russia. But the catch over here is that Russia do not trust Japan and its currency, the yen. So how would this trade happen? Well, Japan can pay with US dollars and Russia would happily take it. Why? because they knew for sure that this X amount of US dollars could be exchanged for gold with the United States. On top of that, if they do not want the gold from the US, they can simply store it in their reserves and use this for payments when they purchase goods from any other country, let's assume China. The Bretton Woods Agreement simply removes the hassle of comparing Russian ruble, the Japanese yen, and the Chinese renminbi while making payments and simplifies the payment process. This is how the US dollar emerged as an instrument of trust for international trade, and countries began to accumulate US dollar instead of gold. And even today, this trend continues. As of the fourth quarter of 2023, the central banks of the foreign countries held more than half of their reserves in US dollars. The Bretton Woods Agreement worked alright, and it certainly enabled a level of global trade that was inconceivable up to that point. But of course, there were problems. See, currencies sort of act like shock absorbers for international trade. If left to do their own thing, they will naturally increase and decrease in value as the economies they represent go through periods of booms and busts. If an economy is experiencing a downturn, its currency will lose value in foreign exchange. Why? Simply because since its economy isn't functioning effectively, it will produce fewer goods, which will naturally create a less demand for its currency among international buyers. And vice versa will happen if an economy is doing really well. Now here comes the important part, so I urge you to listen carefully. If the value of a currency is fixed, then these self-correcting forces cannot do their own thing, and economies can quickly spiral out of control. So if the US was doing well, then in a floating model, its currency should have increased in value, right? But guess what? The US economy was not particularly healthy towards the end of the 1960s. It's because of numerous reasons like the Vietnam War and a number of domestic issues. But remember the Bretton Woods Agreement? The price of the US dollar is fixed by a certain amount of gold. Since the US economy is going through a rough patch, its currency should be devalued. But as per the Bretton Woods Agreement, its value is fixed, which means the US dollar has now become overvalued. The other Bretton Woods countries saw that the American dollar was overvalued relative to what it should be. Obviously, they wouldn't want to trade their own currencies for the US dollar while it was overvalued, but they had another option. They could trade their relatively overvalued US dollars for physical gold. Most participating countries, especially the French, started trading more and more of their American reserves in for gold, which caused two big issues for the US. First, it reduced America's economic influence because now countries are holding gold instead of the US dollars. Second, America simply did not have enough gold to cover dollar in circulations outside the United States. Their gold reserves have plummeted to 10,000 tons in 1970. So long story short, if the US keeps on exchanging the US dollar with gold, it could have wiped out the US dollar reserves. And this is when President Richard Nixon gave his most infamous speech and declared a temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
This announcement sent a shock wave around the world which is known as the Nixon shock. The Bretton Woods system had finally collapsed in 1973 and led to the rise of the fiat currency system which still exists today. And immediately after this announcement, the French government sent its warship for the final time to take back its gold reserves by exchanging the overvalued US dollars. Now you must be thinking that as the US entered the Bretton Woods Agreement, many countries must have revolted against the United States and abandoned the US dollar, right? Well, of course not. This is why, ladies and gentlemen, the US made a genius move that cemented its position as not only the global reserve currency but also as the most powerful currency in the world. In the 1930s, American companies were searching all over the world for crude oil reserves, and to their luck in 1938, an American-owned oil well in Saudi Arabia drilled into a huge source of oil reserves. Saudi Arabia's economy, which wasn't rich yet, neither had the technological advancement nor the acumen to use it for development, so they partnered with the US companies to extract oil. But to their bad luck during the World War II, Italy bombed Saudi Arabia to target American facilities extracting oil. Because of this, they struggled to produce oil. So while Saudi Arabia desperately needed protection, America saw the huge potential of this commodity in the post-war world. So on Valentine's Day 1945, President Franklin Roosevelt met with the Saudi king and forged the basis of a long relationship. This 5-hour discussion led to the groundwork for closer US-Saudi relations. Later, the US struck a deal with the kingdom in 1974 and eventually with the major oil-producing countries that changed the fate of the US dollar. And the agreement was the petrodollar agreement. Under this agreement, the US committed to protect Saudi Arabia from any future attacks and provide them the latest US-made military equipment. And in return, Saudi Arabia agreed to sell oil exclusively in US dollars. But how did selling oil in the US dollar make the dollar more powerful? See, only a few countries are blessed with enough oil reserves in the world, and every country in the world needs this critical commodity to fuel its economic growth. So there is a consistent demand for oil, and as the oil now being sold exclusively in the US dollars, countries that want to purchase oil have to make the payment in the US dollars. This created a consistent demand for the US dollar, which significantly boosted the dollar status as the world's primary reserve currency. But the best part was that instead of storing these billions of dollars of oil revenues in their reserves, Saudi Arabia invests this money in US Treasury securities. Well, the US Treasury securities are issued by the United States government to raise money, and when people and other countries buy these securities, they're essentially lending money to the US government, and in return, the US government promises to pay them back with a little bit of extra money called interest. Not the Saudi Arabia, but many countries invest this significant portion of their dollar reserves in the US Treasury securities. Why? Because they are considered very safe and the US government always pays its debt. This makes these securities a reliable choice for saving money. And if you look at the number, it is mind-boggling. As of April 2024, Japan had approximately $1.1 trillion in US Treasury securities. China holds $749 billion, the United Kingdom holds $690 billion, and India holds approximately $200 billion. So in total, foreign countries owns approximately $7.9 trillion in US Treasury securities, twice the GDP of India. So the US dollar's role as the primary currency for oil and other commodities further entrenched its position, making it difficult for countries to shift away from it without disrupting their own economies. If you're a country that wants to buy something from the international market, you need the US dollar. If you're a country doing not so well, seek a loan from the World Bank, you will be given US dollar. If you are a country doing extremely well and wants to invest this excess dollar surplus, the US financial market are a safe place for you to park your money. And if you are a country that dare to go against the mighty US, your reserves will be frozen. The widespread use of the dollar in the global transaction has created a self-reinforcing cycle, but the more the dollar is used, the more attractive it becomes. This inertia and network effect make it difficult for countries to challenge the dollar's dominance, as switching costs are high and the benefits of using the dollar increase with its adoption. This is how the US dollar became the most powerful currency in the world, and despite recent challenges, the US dollar is still king today. That's all from today's video. I just hope you found this video insightful. If yes, then please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel for more such insightful case studies. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Till then, goodbye.